I think my work comes from a number of different well springs. One of which I know is the object of virtue. I think the things that go into a cabinet of curiosity. But also, I've always been very intrigued by reliquaries and the idea of containment of precious objects, and the idea that by enshrining an object, you make it more precious. And also the 18th century gentleman's desk toys, the sort of beautifully made scientific instruments. And I think with artworks like the Albigensian Heresy, I was trying to make a scientific instrument for metaphysical rather than scientific ends. Always I would describe myself first as a sculptor. Carving is the means by which I make it, but the scale of the objects one makes, obviously it does affect their form, but I would hope that any object I made had the integrity that if you were to 3D print it at 6 times the scale, it would still read well as a sculpture. I'd be disappointed if it didn't. I've always been intrigued with the darker side of the world and the darker side of thought and imagination. In my teens, I read all of Edgar Allan Poe and the various kind of Victorian Edwardian ghostwriters. I've always enjoyed a chill and the thrill of the possibility of the supernatural. So certainly that comes through in my work. But I'm also interested in the natural form, in the kind of dynamism of living things. And nothing ever pops into my... Well, no, I lie. I was going to say that nothing ever pops into my head fully formed. Occasionally it does. I sometimes dream objects. But most of the time there's quite a long gestation, which can be from a few days to a number of years. And objects kind of get polished and shaped and reshaped until they finally emerge. I was talking about long gestation of work, and you can't get much longer than The Haunted Doll's House, which I can't remember when I first read The Haunted Doll's House, but it was certainly in my earliest teens. And I can remember even then thinking I would love to make a haunted doll's house. I mean, then I suppose the ghost would have been... Well, I don't know what the ghost would have been. Maybe it would have just been a carving or something. But that was something that I internalised and which gestated over at least 30 years in some fashion, and began to crystallise maybe about 20 years ago. And then more recently still, probably in the last 10 years or 5 years, I started to think of it in terms of a comic strip. So the Doll's House is read from the bottom to the top, and M.R. James' story, or a variation thereof, is told through the tableau of each room. And from that to actually starting to think about the practicalities of the shape of it and of course how the ghost works, which is something that I've only learned how to do in the last decade. So all of that has been going on in the last 2 years, I suppose. And then I made the bloody thing. I think the use of precious and rare and loaded materials I think it serves a number of purposes. The first is that it simply denotes worth upon the object. You know, if you use semi-precious stones for eyes, it lifts the perception of the work. So that's a slightly fraudulent use. But I think the other use is just it's rich materials add depth and complexity. I love opals because they're in fact incredibly complex objects. Even a tiny opal has got scores of flecks of colour and fire in. But also, I quite often use materials because they're laden with meaning. I work with tagu and as a substitute for ivory. Obviously, working with ivory is extremely morally laden. Tagu nuts they're a Pacific Rim nut, which dries very hard, and probably as hard as bone or ivory. They're limited in size. The largest tagu nut you'll find will be about, I suppose, 2 inches in circumference, something like that. Not big. And they always have a hollow in the middle, which means that you have to either carve them whole quite superficially, or if you're using slices of them, the slice is quite limited. It's easier to work than bones and so on, and smells much nicer. It doesn't smell of the dentist, which is certainly a relief. And polishes up, I think, as beautiful as ivory. Every bit is beautiful. It's a lovely material. I've got a vast variety of tools. A lot of Victorian chisels and carving tools, because nobody has ever beaten Victorian tool steel, which is very high carbon, which meant that it's got a very great tensile strength and it sharpens beautifully. I've got some Japanese carving tools, again, they're very high quality. And I work with surgical scalpels. And I do work with machines as well, the kind of basic forming I do with bandsaw, power saw, and handheld rotary drills. But by the time you're getting down to your final surface, it has to be hand tools. And you have to carve. I've found that when I'm carving fine detail, hair for instance, for some reason I'm much better at it in the small hours of the morning. So I save the finest carving for about 2:00 in the morning. In carving, I was self-taught, although I was at art college, and there were a couple of stone sculptors in the staff, but nobody who carved wood, nobody who had any experience of it at all. So I just kind of sat down with a piece of wood and some borrowed carving tools and tinkered. I've created several video games, and video games are, I think, modern video games are intensely sculptural. It's just a sculpture that you happen to be inside rather than one that you're outside and perceiving. So I've created video games. I created one based on a full restoration to 13th century form of Knaresborough Castle. And that as a sculptural exercise is a fascinating thing to do. And then actually having the freedom to explore it from within is very intriguing. And I've long used 3D modelling programs, computer programs, for designing artworks. I had a commission for the Jersey Museums Trust for 12 prayer nuts, and I designed those on computer because it's much easier to do that way. And in terms of video projection, the video projection that I tend to do, usually with my colleague Shanaz Gulzar, is onto buildings, and it's transformational of the building. So again, it becomes a form of sculpture. You turn the building into a sculpture. But also, more recently, I've been working on what I call reality games with Shanaz or alone, and those are theatrical adventures that people perceive, again, like in a video game, as a participant. So they're something like miracle plays, I suppose. It's a kind of promenade performance where a narrative kind of gradually unfolds as you progress through it. But those go back to my dark themes. So we did one recently, Hand in Hand, which took people across Doncaster Borough. I mean, it was a whole day's investment for players. But that was based on a medieval legend, and the focus of it, the heart of it, was a skeletal hand with an oxidised silver ring. So I was still going back to those materials, precious materials, materials laden with all sorts of meaning.